So the Secular Student Alliance seeks to normalize secular identity and spread secular values. And secular values are those values focused around the well-being of the current and future world. We do this work by empowering students who share our goals. And I hope all of us in this room want to help make the future a better place. And I see anyone who is taking action to make the future a better place as an activist. So I see all of us here at this conference as activists. And here's the thing. Being an activist is hard work. There is no script. You will have setbacks, you will make mistakes, you will have failures. And in order to keep your spirits high, it's incredibly important to look to those who've gone before you and see how they have gone through difficult times and persevered and succeeded, even though it didn't always look like their victory was inevitable. And that is what we're here to do tonight with the Secular Student Alliance Backbone Award. Every year since 2004, we've taken time to recognize someone who has gone before us and lived the kind of lives that we want to live. A life of action. And it's in the form of the SSA Backbone Award that we recognize people who have contributed to bettering the world in such a profound way that intelligence and grit and guts were not enough. But they needed to have persistence. They needed to keep at it and to keep working year after year in the face of all of those difficulties and all of those challenges. They needed to have backbone, if you will. And tonight's winner has been at the forefront of the movement over the last several years to make secularism a more intersectional movement. Her book, Moral Combat, Black Atheists, Gender Politics, and the Values Wars, makes a powerful case about how exactly atheism and secular humanism are ridiculously important to the lives of people who have been disempowered or told that they're worthless by society's mainstream voices. And her Women's Leadership Project and First in the Family Scholarship Program have put the theory expressed in that book and other books into practice and have given the chance to go to college to people who wouldn't otherwise probably have that chance. People who are undocumented or homeless or LGBTQ or in the foster care system or otherwise system involved. Not only have those programs given the people in them the support to do that, but they've also had an explicitly humanistic message that told the young people involved in them that the paradigms that they've been handed about how they weren't right, about how they weren't good people, about how they needed to conform or not express their true identity, about how all those paradigms are broken. And the Backbone Award is one of the Secular Student Alliance's longest-standing traditions. This will be the 13th year that it's been given, and from my little, triskaidekaphobia loving heart, I'm really excited that it's in its 13th year. I think that's spectacular. But as much as we like to form traditions, I think that as humanists and secularists, we should also be excited about occasionally breaking from those traditions. And we're having a slight deviation from our normal tradition of me standing up here and talking and presenting the whole award, because once one of my good friends and one of the most respected activists I know, not our award winner, came to me when he heard that Sikivu was going to win this award. Oops, I gave it away. Found out we were going to give this award tonight to who we were going to give it. He was like, "Oh my gosh, August, that's incredible. I'm so excited about that. That's such a great choice. Can I help?" And I said, "Of course you can, Dan. So please allow me to introduce Dan Pemberton to the stage."
Hi. As a brief preface to this, I was told I have 5 minutes, and I thought that's a great challenge. And then an hour ago, I had to accept defeat and cut it down from 20. So I am very well aware that there is plenty that is not in this. You don't need to tweet me after the event and say, did you missed this, that, or the other thing. I was first introduced to the work of Dr. Sikivu Hutchinson at SSA Con 2013. She opened the event with a talk on social justice and the school-to-prison pipeline. As a young convert to the new atheism, I had read countless books that promised the utopia of social and political equality if only the government's neighboring churches would stay on their side of the fence. But this was the first time I had ever seen someone make the subject so front and center. At the time, a few of her talks were on YouTube, but what really caught my attention later on was when a year later I learned she was organizing this upcoming conference in LA called Moving Social Justice. I knew I had to be there, but quite honestly, I had no idea what to expect, let alone could I have imagined the indelible impact such an event would have on my work with campus groups. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. If you want to get inside the brain of a leader, look at the events they organize, specifically the programming they build, the contributors they invite, and the risks they take. At Moving Social Justice, I didn't just see the secular movement's most talented up-and-coming activists and thinkers. What's more, there were local activists who clearly spent so very much of their time in the trenches and so very little time speaking to an audience. These are not the kind of activists you find on the internet. These are the kind you only meet when you are with them on the front lines. This made for one of the most consistently raw and disarming experiences I've ever had. What's more, it was a glimpse into how Sikivu Hutchinson sees the world. And I don't mean the movement or her community, but rather our society. Moving Social Justice redefined intersectionality and reimagined the promise and potential of the secular movement. It took many issues head on and in ways none of us had ever seen before, no less of which were LGBTQ, queer atheists of color, feminists of color organizing, and ending the school-to-prison pipeline. My personal favorite. The experience produced not one, but 2 internal reviews at the SSA with more than enough material for a third. And it did not take long for so very much of this to shape the goals and strategies of the national organization as a whole. But on a more local level, at the same time, I was organizing a regional leadership conference for secular students. When I returned from Moving Social Justice, I contacted the other student organizers and said, we've got to rethink this. I told them I wanted to bring as much of Moving Social Justice to our event as we could. And I said, this isn't going to happen with just 1 or 2 talks. It's not going to come from just a different speaker lineup. We are going to start over. Our entire vision, our strategy, even the new planning team members, everything changes now. Our logic was simple. The words and voices we give to young people now are what they are driven by, and we realized that we were in the best possible position to expose them to the minds we wanted to influence them. When SwissCon came, interestingly enough, none of the other authors brought their books to sell. It ended up that only Sikivu's books landed on our merch table. To this day, there are many young people who have Moral Combat and Godless Americana as the only atheist books they have ever read. You ask them who the 4 horsemen are, many 18 and 19-year-olds do not know what you are talking about. And as one of the movement's best writers, extemporaneous orators, and organizers, I am convinced Sikivu Hutchinson will have a permanent place in the history of American secularism. It is with great honor to present her with the 2016 SSA Backbone Award.
Okay, good evening. Good evening. I didn't know if I had a live audience out there. I want to say that I'm very humbled and honored by the overview by August and by Dan. Wow, greatly appreciative. I'm very much a supporter and an ardent fan of everything that SSA does. SSA has been a staunch supporter of Black Skeptics Los Angeles over the past several years. August mentioned the Women's Leadership Project. We started a male cohort called Young Male Scholars a few years ago, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. But it's been an awesome ride, to say the least. And as you were speaking, I was thinking, does SSA have an elementary school component?
We do not yet.
Okay. Well, we need one in South LA, a 74th Street Elementary School. My daughter is a fist in the air, Black atheist, and we need someone to be on the trenches challenging the baby Bible thumpers that she's dealing with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about intersectionality, particularly in the climate and the context that we're in now. Last week, before the carnage, I visited my alma mater, UCLA, which has gotten even whiter and brighter and more ivory tower-esque since I was there in the era of Public Enemy and Duran Duran. And I was there on campus as part of a tour that was conducted by the Level Playing Field Institute, which is a STEM immersion program that offers initiatives for high school youth of color. And I had the opportunity to talk to an African-American male computer science Ph.D. And he was teaching his 9th and 10th grade students how to code. And so he told me that when he entered UCLA not long ago, there were no students who looked like him, much less professors, and this in a discipline that has approximately 0.01% African-American representation. And so going back to the Tony multi-million-dollar enclave of UCLA that week, in my mind, was part of a journey that week into the mythos of American meritocracy, where I began at UCLA, which has a negligible African-American population, and ended the week at Scott and Scudder Young Women's Juvenile Camp up in Santa Clarita, California, where I teach a women's leadership class to a predominantly African-American and Latina group of young women who overwhelmingly identify as queer, who overwhelmingly have been pushed out of their schools, kicked out of their homes, victimized by sexual and physical abuse, and shared the collective trauma and experience of not being viewed as scientists, as scholars, as potential intellectuals, but being demonized as coming from deficit-laden cultures. And so this American is apple pie narrative that many of us are familiar with but do not live directly, of the expendable young person, the throwaway young person, is where many of my most burningly brilliant youth live. Their lives are informed by loss, mourning, and death on a day-to-day basis. Their writings reflect it, their discussions reflect it. A recent discussion that I had with one of my gender nonconforming young women highlighted this when she talked about being a poet and a songwriter, very shy and very retreating young person. But she shared one of her poems and said, writing helped her to think, to resolve crises and work through pain, to carve out a quiet space of contemplation, and to go to that vaunted deep purple space of imagination, to blast off to her own refuge from monsters and minotaurs, where black girls, according to the racist, sexist playbook of American literary genius, are not supposed to go. When my students talk about terrorism, it has a distinctly American face. When they talk about occupied territory, they're talking about their neighborhoods and schools. And when they invoke the specter of imperialism using other language, they're simply hearkening back to what the Black Panther Party characterized in the 1960s as the colonization and stigmatization of black and brown communities. And yet it is far too easy, nauseatingly so, for so-called enlightened secularists to identify the tyranny of state violence out there in those so-called backward theocratic regimes in the third world. It is nauseatingly easy for said enlightened secularists to monomaniacally focus on organized religion whilst being colorblind to the institutional racism that informs the privilege of having to go to a college or university where the majority of the student body looks like you, and the majority of the administrators look like you, the decision makers, the shot callers, and the bigwigs look like you, and where it's assumed that if you rise and excel in an elite discipline like computer science, or engineering, or physics, or philosophy, all revered in our vaunted secular community, it's assumed that you rise and excel due to individual merit rather than the vast array of unearned privileges and advantages conferred upon you via what the great freethinker W.E.B. Du Bois termed the wages of whiteness. In 2013, when BSLA awarded 5 South LA youth of color, the world was awaiting the Trayvon Martin murder verdict. A couple of years later, when we awarded another cohort of young people scholarships in 2015, a videotape surfaced of an African-American girl being assaulted by a school resource officer in a high school in South Carolina for simply having the temerity not to put down her cell phone on demand. And this was also the year that some of you may recall that Sandra Bland was apprehended by a white police officer and found dead several days later in her jail cell in Texas. And now here we are in 2016, mourning the execution of 2 black fathers, Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, as well as the murders of Dallas police. And so the conditions on our elementary school campuses, our middle school campuses, our high school campuses, and of course, our college and university campuses are not separate from these states of siege and from these conditions of new Jim Crow. Many of you got to college because you had someone. You had an apparatus. You had a college center. You had a college counselor. You had a dean. You had a whole regime of expectations undergirding you. Well, I'm here to tell you that most of my students do not have that. That most of my students have a more significant relationship with law enforcement than they do with a college center or a dean or a counselor. A few years ago, at one of the schools that I work at, I was shown the list of college-bound seniors by that school's principal, and it didn't have a black male name on it. And this was at a school where African Americans are second in population to Latino students. And this was also the year where we were motivated to begin the Young Male Scholars Program for black boys, beginning in 9th grade, because of this insidious dynamic of constantly pipelining black boys into either prisons and jails or sports. And so the absent spaces on that college list are a thoroughgoing indictment of the illusion of equity in American K-12 education, where African American children learn very early on that white supremacist state violence disguised as normalcy, disguised as law and order, is going to inform and shape their lives to the extent that they may not survive beyond childhood. Last year, when we were talking about the impact of state violence on the lives of black girls and women specifically, one of my students, named Teray, a Women's Leadership Project young person, talked about how when she was watching a fight outside of school, she was handcuffed by a school resource officer for simply watching a fight. And so she bitterly commented that had she been a white girl, she would have gotten Starbucks and some Uggs. And so her comment crystallized this intersection of policing and criminalization and push out in K-12 education, specifically for black girls, underscores the dynamic whereby black girls are never deemed to be feminine, nor innocent, nor worthy of protection, have the highest rates of suspension, expulsion, and push-out in the nation next to black boys, are impacted not just by what we commonly know as the school-to-prison pipeline, but also the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, where scores and scores of girls of color are being pipelined into incarceration by dint of being sexually victimized. But these are not the kinds of policy and discourse items that appear within the mainstream context. Black girls are never the proper victims of state violence, and this despite the fact that black queer women founded the Black Lives Matter movement and have always been on the point when it comes to intersectionality. There is no national mobilization for the scores and scores of trans women of color who are brutalized, terrorized, and murdered year in and year out. These are not deemed to be proper bodies when we talk about who is most heavily impacted by state violence. And so our bodies, yes, are bound by the new Jim Crow apartheid with an exceptionalist, meritocratic America. And so our humanist agenda is not separable from an anti-racist, anti-heterosexist, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist agenda. But far too often, within the white secular world, this is eclipsed by a narrow, reductive focus that doesn't consider the brutal impact of socioeconomic inequality and wealth schisms that are racialized in the US. Because it's one thing to be a white middle-class person in relatively affluent West Side Los Angeles and decry the bigotry of organized religion and say to hell with the church. It's quite another thing to be a middle-class person of color in South LA or East Baltimore or Detroit or Columbus or Newark, where in many instances churches, not co-signing or endorsing, but simply stating the reality. Churches and faith-based institutions are often the most visible and accessible providers of homelessness assistance, of utilities assistance, of recreational space, of scholarship assistance, of prisoner reentry resources. And so the question and the challenge for millennial organizers in the audience is, what are culturally relevant humanist alternatives in this age of new Jim Crow going to look like? Because it's no longer acceptable for white secularists to run over to the quote-unquote third world and play the white secular savior to the backward religious others. One of the reasons why we developed BSLA's First in the Family Humanist Scholarship was because undocumented foster care, homeless, and LGBTQ youth have egregiously high prison pipelining rates, off the charts. If you look at the population of California prisons, half of the adult population in California prisons came from the foster care system. And yet the secular movement continues to bedevil and to spit out white-splaining articles like, this is a good one, atheists don't owe your social justice agenda a damn thing. Continue to decry people of color corrupting the purity of the movement with social justice, with concerns about apartheid and the new Jim Crow. And so at the end of the day, if millennial secular activism and humanist belief are going to go beyond the bromides of celebrating diversity and well-intentioned white allyship, intersectionality will have to be more than a sexy buzzword. Otherwise, these are promises, soft ones, asking power, in the words of the great freethinker Frederick Douglass, to concede nothing without demand. Thank you.